Okay, wonderful. Welcome everyone to part one of our training called Granted, the Architecture of Grant Seeking for Progressive Social Change. My name is Stanley Tsenkoff and I'm the Capacity Building Manager at the Fund for Santa Barbara.
Hola, bienvenidos a todos a el taller de con fondos, que será un taller de la arquitectura de la búsqueda de fondos para el cambio social. Mi nombre es Stanley, estoy con el Fondo de Santa Bárbara.
And I'd like to first and foremost introduce our Spanish-English language interpreter, Naira Pacheco, who will guide us through how to access our interpretation for today. Welcome and thanks so much, Naira.
Y antes que nada me gustaría presentar a nuestra intérprete al español que estará interpretando para esta sesión, Naira Pacheco. Muchas gracias. Hola, buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a esta sesión y taller. El Fondo de Santa Bárbara se ha comprometido a crear un espacio de justicia del lenguaje y por ende esta sesión estará interpretada del inglés al español. So hello everybody, good morning, welcome to this session. The Fund for Santa Barbara has committed to creating a space for language justice, and because of that we will be interpreting this session from English to Spanish. En unos momentos, cuando se active la función de interpretación, ustedes van a ver un icono de globo al fondo y a la derecha de su pantalla. Ustedes podrán hacer clic ahí y seleccionar el idioma en el que quieren escuchar el taller. In just a few moments, when the interpretation function will be activated, you will see a small globe at the bottom right corner of your screen appear, and you can click on that globe and select the language that you want to listen to this session in. Si usted habla inglés, usted puede escoger el canal de inglés o permanecerse en la sala principal, ya que esta presentación entera va a ser en inglés. Pero si quiere escuchar en español, va a tener que seleccionar el canal de español para poder escuchar en español. También podrá usar el chat para comunicarse en cualquier idioma que se sienta cómodo. Y si tiene problemas accediendo a la función de interpretación, también lo puede comunicar dentro del chat. If you speak English or understand English, you can select the English channel or select or not select anything and just stay on the main floor. If you speak Spanish, you will have to select the Spanish channel in order to listen to the presentation in Spanish. If you have any issues accessing the interpretation function, you can let us know in the chat. We will also be translating any comments that are written in Spanish in the chat as well. Y aquí ven las instrucciones en la pantalla. Si necesita más dirección, you have the instructions here on the screen if you need more support. Y ya con eso podemos activar la función. So we are ready to activate the feature. Gracias. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Naida. And in just one moment, we will be activating our interpretation feature. Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for your patience, everybody. And now I'm excited to go ahead and introduce our wonderful presenters, Jennifer Navarro Rios, Suzanne Valerie, and Rachel Johnson, who are going to be joining us and sharing their wealth of insight into this topic. I'm really excited that and proud to say that they are also on our grant making committee for the Fund for Santa Barbara, and have spent dozens of hours sharing their insight and experience into crafting this curriculum. And I really encourage everybody to check out more about each and every one of them on our landing page. It's been a joy working with them on this really important topic, and I'm excited to spend this time with you all as well as them. And so without further ado, I'll be sharing my screen, and would like to welcome the three of them to introduce themselves really briefly.
I guess we're just going to go in order from left to right. Well, I'm Jennifer.
That's perfect.
I'm Jennifer Navarro Rios. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm really excited to be here with you all and share some information today.
Hello, Suzanne Valerie, and I'm many years of experience in all aspects of the grants universe, and now I'm very pleased to be working with the fund on the funding side of things. And this training is going to be interesting. I've enjoyed working with Rachel and Jennifer on putting this together, and Stanley. And so welcome to all of you.
Hi all, my name is Rachel Johnson, she, her pronouns. I too have worked for many, many years in the grant seeking world and volunteer on the Fund's grant making committee. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Jennifer and Suzanne on this. We get to work together in the giving grants side of things on the grant making committee. So it's really been amazing to come together and pool all of our resources from our grant seeking experience as well to share with you today.
Of course, I made the newbie mistake of not unmuting myself. So again, thank you all so much. Just a quick note about the Fund for Santa Barbara. We are a regional community foundation advancing progressive social change, and we support movement building through 5 different strategies, which you'll see on your screen. And this workshop series is really intended to cover a few overlapping set of strategies, which I think you'll see through our time together. Certainly, we are excited that we'll be building the capacity of social change organizations to expand their fund development. This is also about influencing philanthropy, because as you'll see in our curriculum, our presenters are looking at how to navigate the oftentimes challenging grant funding world as well. And certainly this relates to making grants as well. So happy to share more anytime, but just want to leave you all with that for now. And just proud to say that we're on our 40th year in operation as the Fund for Santa Barbara. So please stay in touch, and we're excited to connect with everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on Chumash land. I know that we are doing this presentation virtually, but I suppose that everybody joining us, or a lot of the folks joining us, are on Chumash land. So please, let's take a moment to read the statement here and just acknowledge the importance of that. Great. Thank you so much for acknowledging that as well. So I'm excited. Today you'll see quite a bit of topics, introductory topics covered. And the intent of today's workshop, again, this is one of 3 workshops coming up. But we hope that as you're joining us, we will have you better understand the rules of navigating grant seeking. What are they explicitly? What are they implicitly? We also want you to better hone in on your skills when it comes to successful or fundable proposals. We'll also equip you with the tools and resources available to write these grants, and really want to focus on how your organization can better convey its social need, social change mission. So let's go ahead and take a look at the three different areas that we'll be taking a look at. Rachel will be guiding us through the systemic rules of grant seeking. Suzanne will be looking at the architecture scaffolding of constructing a proposal. And Jennifer will be guiding us through an introduction on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's go ahead and dive right in with the systemic rules of grant seeking, and we'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you, Stanley. Yeah, so before getting into the particulars of grant proposals, we wanted to lay some of the groundwork about how grants are different from other types of fundraising that you might be used to, and also look at some of the underlying systems in place that sort of make the grant funding world what it is. To that end, this first workshop, as you sort of saw in the outline, is going to be bookended by some overarching themes and topics that we think are important to inform both the way that you will go out and seek grants, but also that inform the way the grant funding landscape has been designed and how it operates. So the first thing before we jump in is just a quick overview, you can see on the next slide, of how grant seeking is different than major gift funding. So if you've worked at all with fundraising in your organization, you're likely a little bit familiar with individual giving as well. This is where you are cultivating individual donors to write you checks. And the main sort of tenets of individual giving is, first is that it's usually relationship based. Sometimes you're cold calling people, but generally this is someone that you have a relationship with, you've been introduced to, they've got some interest and buy-in to your organization. And because it's relationship based, there's also sort of a relational life cycle and cultivation to it. So you don't ask someone for a six-figure check the first time you meet them. You probably invite them to events, you bring them in, get them to learn more about your organization, to sort of bring them along the donor life cycle before actually asking for money. Some aspects of individual giving, because of that, make it a little bit of a lengthier process. You don't get the money right away. You build a relationship first, but then that often also leads to lengthier giving, where once they've said yes to you, they tend to say yes more and more. So if you build the relationship well, you get to sort of have a lasting relationship. And because it's relational, you also have a lot of conversation and negotiation. So individuals, if a need comes up that they've never supported before, you have a relationship in place to approach that individual and maybe negotiate a different giving amount for a particular time or direct their giving to somewhere else where it's needed. Grant funding, in many ways, feels opposite of that kind of relationship. So grant funding tends to be transactional, so you sometimes don't interact at all with a person. It might be a guideline that's sent out with an announcement of funding. You write a proposal, you send it in, and then you either get an award letter or decline letter. There's also inherent in grant funding an imposed cycle, a calendar usually. And unlike a person that you can just call up sort of whenever a need emerges, grant funding tends to have deadlines. So they operate on a cycle that you can't really alter if you need to. Within that, there's specific time frames. Sometimes they change what they fund from one year to the next or one funding cycle to the next. And a grant funder will usually present to you funding priorities, program preferences, things that they are interested in giving to, rather than letting you tell them what you might need. And then within grant funding, there are categories. So foundation funding, so large foundations that exist to give money. There's community foundations, there's corporate foundations, and they will usually have particular priorities that align with their own mission. There's also state and federal grants, so public funding, and that tends to be the most systematic and the most rigorous in terms of guidelines and application procedures and reporting procedures, because it's public money, so it's paid for through taxes, and generally that means it has to be really tightly controlled. And then there's also family foundations that we'll mention a couple times, and those tend to be a bit like a hybrid. So family foundations are just that, they're foundations, they exist to give money, but they're generally run by members of a family or trustees who have been given control of the foundation by the individual who started the family foundation in the first place. So sometimes you can cultivate them like you would an individual donor, but they might still have a grant process or an application and reporting procedure that you have to follow as well. So to give a little more context to that, since we anticipate that a lot of the people that signed up for this workshop have applied to the fund before, on the next slide you'll see the so a comparison of applying to the fund and applying to other funders. So Stanley, can you jump to the next slide? That is, there we go. So just to put it in terms of something maybe that you've experienced by going through one of these grant processes. So there are different models. The fund, as you've experienced, but maybe you didn't know the particulars of why, is a very unique funding model. It has a very thoughtful process of grant making that is really different than a lot of other funders. So the main thing you would first experience with the fund is in-person grant application workshops. So as soon as a grant is announced or a cycle has started, there's also a schedule of in-person workshops or on Zoom, now that this world is more virtual. But when they're in person, they take place in North County, South County, Mid-County. They're sort of built around equity and access so that people who are interested in applying for grants have a workshop to go to first at the very beginning. Throughout the process, there's hands-on technical assistance. So you have access to staff, people like Stanley and the grants associates, and the fund staff is always very accessible. They even offer a pre-screening process where you can tell them what you're thinking about applying for, and they'll give you feedback on whether or not that feels like a fit. And then when you actually apply, you still have access to staff, but you also then have a really interesting model of how applications are vetted with the grant making committee. So that's pretty unique, having a group of community activists and nonprofit professionals and a whole variety of people, peers often from your community, who come together in this collaborative way to make decisions about grant applications. Part of that collaborative process is site visits. So it's not just reading the application and making a decision, but grant making committee members will actually come and meet with you and ask follow-up questions and learn more about your organization in a more relational setting. And then when the grant making committee does make its decisions, they always offer those decisions with feedback. So you're hearing all the positives if your application is accepted and why the grant making committee was really behind supporting the application. If you don't get funding from the fund, you hear also lots of constructive feedback of how to strengthen the proposal next time and why it didn't quite make the process during that cycle. The experience with other grant funders, if you haven't applied to them, you'll feel that this is really different. Most grant funders tend to be fairly impersonal. So you'll get a call that there's an open call for applications. Sometimes it's actually by invitation only, which is even sort of more impersonal if you can't even kind of respond to a public call. They'll send out guideline documents so you know what they require. And you might have a webinar that's been pre-recorded or a technical workshop, but definitely not as common to have such access to staff. Once you've applied, you usually don't know who your reviewers are. Most foundations, a lot of foundations don't even sort of reference that part of the process. And with federal grants and state grants, you'll know vaguely sort of who, what kind of sectors or industries your vetters are from, but you might not know anything at all about who's reviewing your application. So all of that leads to a bit of a covert process. And then when the decision is made, you don't always get feedback right away. So if they offer feedback, you usually have to seek it out. If you have a relationship with someone at the foundation, you can ask, but there's not generally anything beyond a pretty simple letter of decline, or a letter of award for that matter. Either way, they don't often offer much feedback. And usually that's because of things like workload, and it's a very labor-intensive side of the grant-making process. So keep these differences in mind now as we go forward. We're going to talk about some of the systems in play in the world of grant seeking. So I call them, if you'll see on the next slide, sort of the systems of oppression in grant seeking. But more broadly, I just kind of want to introduce some of the oppressive systems that are inherent in the world of philanthropy. So one of the reasons applying to the fund feels so different is that there are these underlying assumptions that make foundations design themselves either one way or another, usually around equity and access type issues. Many of the things I'm going to talk about feel like unwritten rules as well. So part of the purpose of these workshops is to help you understand how to recognize the implicit rules, the ones that aren't maybe laid out in the guidelines, and how to succeed despite them. So how to work within a system that sort of has some things in place that ideally, as organizations working towards social change, we would want to see be different, but we also want to win some money now before that system is changed. So a couple things that have been, oh, sorry, no, you can say the other one, I'm not there yet, but a couple things that have come up in recent news, so just to reference, last couple of years, to get at some of the larger overarching themes of how philanthropy intersects with oppression. So many sectors right now are being scrutinized or scrutinizing their own inherent systems of oppression, right? Right now we're seeing the history and systems of policing, public safety, mass incarceration being investigated more so than they have been prior. Movements like Me Too a few years ago now in the corporate and entertainment sectors, where people really started to investigate, you know, what are some of these underlying things that are not talked about in these sectors. And then of course now, race and white supremacy as a centuries-old constructs that are affecting pretty much every sector in our world, and people are really starting to talk more definitively about in terms of how they affect our systems of education, environmental justice, government, politics, everything. So philanthropy and fundraising, charitable giving, it also has decades of conventions and assumptions underlying the whole process of one entity giving money to another for a particular purpose. Unfortunately, we don't have time to also include, you know, an anti-racism workshop within this workshop. So I can't go into too much detail on all of the systems of oppression that play out within philanthropy, but I want to bring up a few here that feel like they relate particularly to the grant-seeking process and the grant-making process of a lot of organizations to set the stage for the rest of the workshop. The first is the idea of saviorism. So philanthropy is really steeped in this idea of saviorism, whether it's white saviorism, wealthy saviorism, there's any number of adjectives you can put in front of that word. But basically it's the idea that one entity decides what the best way is to solve a certain problem. And depending on who that is and who else is in the room when that's being discussed, there is often, you know, one entity that decides they know best, even without the involvement of the population that they're serving. So if you have applied to the fund, you know that there's a question in the application pertaining to the makeup of your own organization's decision-making bodies. So whether that's your board or your program advisory team, and the fund asks that question to sort of get at this idea of, are you incorporating the voices of those you serve in your decision-making process? And that's a way to undermine the sort of dominant model of saviorism within philanthropy. There's also the idea of moral credentialing, and this is very similar to something like optical allyship, in which an organization might want to support grassroots social change organizations so as to appear more culturally relevant. It can be as simple as it's a PR move. There's also sometimes the way this plays out when you are an applicant to a foundation is that they also want to appear that they're investing in equity work, but they might not actually write you a check. Instead of writing you a check or giving you a grant, they might sort of invite you to the table for some thought leadership. And this is sort of a more subtle way of undermining actually investing in social change organizations, but still wanting to appear that they are investing in that. So things like that to look out for in the grant making process too. And then the last one just to bring up is mission alignment in both theory and practice. So a number of times throughout this workshop series, you're going to hear about organizations that tell you what their mission is, and you're going to know what your mission is, and you're going to try to see where those intersect to best know if you are suitable to get funding from that organization. That's something you have to think about is mission alignment. So the way this plays out in assumptions that can sometimes undermine the system is the key to understanding the funder's motivation is to look at, are they actually talking about investing in culturally competent endeavors, social impact investing, but then to turn the table and look at their organization and see, are they actually investing in diversity and inclusionary practices in their own organization? And the last section of this workshop, where Jen's going to dive much deeper into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is a sort of fundamental framework of ideas that we'd love for you to keep in mind as we look at sort of all aspects of the grant seeking process. All right, and now the next slide lays out some data. I wanted to show everyone some quite sobering statistics to give you an idea of what we're actually starting to learn about inequities in funding. And this is sort of grant and social investment type funding of organizations, different types of organizations. I'm starting with a slide of data in this section to show you some statistics, but also to model for you something that we're going to talk about throughout the workshops as well, which is the use of data and how to access data, use it well, collect your own. To that end, I've put up some statistics that I think are interesting to what we're talking about, but also made sure to reference where I got that data so you can look up the research and the articles that data is coming from. So this is data collected by Echoing Green, which is a nonprofit that supports leadership development in organizations that are led by people of color. And it was the Stanford Social Science Innovation Review that published some of this work recently this spring. So one of the things that they found was they were looking at organizations that were Black-led organizations versus white-led organizations. They found that revenues, so all the fundraising, incoming money over the course of a year was 24% lower for Black-led organizations than it was for the white-led organizations that were surveyed. So that's general fundraising. Within the complete fundraising, unrestricted net assets of those organizations that were Black-led, so the unrestricted dollars that are sort of the best dollars to get through all kinds of fundraising, because you can do with them what you need, those were 76% smaller than white-led counterparts. So that's a huge difference as well. That speaks to the way funders look at organizations in terms of who is leading them. So there's definitely, whether that's implicit bias or other factors, there's definitely data that points to some serious underlying assumptions that affect philanthropy in this way. When they surveyed leaders of color in particular about their experiences as seekers of grants and seekers of funding, 63% reported that they felt they had lack of access to individual donors, whereas white leaders of organizations reported at only 49%. And the same with access to foundations. 51% of leaders of color said they didn't think they had access to foundations, and it was only 41% with white leaders. It is significant that everyone, a good majority, even across that average, feels they don't have as much access as they would like to both individual funders and foundations. But there's definitely an equity gap in there as well. And then the last one is just 25% of family foundations use formal diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies in their giving. And that's as much as people are talking about DEI these days and trying to emphasize that in their funding, it's interesting to note that only 25% of the ones surveyed in this particular research survey explicitly talked about those metrics. So that's one of those things where you can look at how an organization practices what it preaches. So if they're not actually integrating those strategies in their giving, but they're telling you they want it from you, that kind of is an indication that there's a disconnect there. All right, and then so what those leaders of color also were asked about were why they felt those lack of access. Like where did those barriers come from? So on the next slide, I'm just going to show you briefly what leaders of color of organizations, what they identified as their main barriers, and then give you some grant seeking equivalents, because to sort of be true to the data, what they were surveyed on was just sort of general access and experience with seeking funding, and that's all kinds of funding with individuals as well as foundations. So I wanted to show you the grant seeking equivalents as well. So first, they said getting connected to funders and funding. So in the grant seeking world, that's basically research tools, access. Do you have the right networks to make you feel like you know where to look for grants even? The second one was building rapport. And this is where a lot of leaders of color identified that they saw some microaggressions and interpersonal bias play out in their relationships with funders. In the grant seeking world, there's not as much interpersonal contact, but still is sort of that factor of access to program officers. The third one, securing support for your organization. So in the grant seeking world, that's ultimately what the vast majority of these workshops is getting at, which is how to write successful applications, how to know these written rules, the unwritten rules, how to convey your message to a funder so that that funder feels that they can invest in you. And then the fourth one was sustaining the relationship. So in the grant seeking world, that is about the back end of grants. Once you've won a grant and secured funding, how do you report back to your funder what you've done? How do you evaluate your own programs and your own success measures and use things like those reports to maintain those organizational relationships? So I want to pause now, and we want to poll all of you who are here participating to see, of those 4 barriers to funding, which one do you feel is the one you most resonate with? So getting connected, building rapport, securing the support, or sustaining the relationship. So we'll give you, there's the poll. You can see it looks like, yes, it's in the same order as on this slide. So whether you're seeing the poll in English or Spanish, I think you should be able to determine which ones of those you want to see. And we will, oh look, even as a panelist, I get to submit a response as well. So we'll give that a couple of seconds, and then when Stanley shares the results, we'll kind of talk through that before moving on.
Wonderful. It looks like we have about 2/3 of folks who have voted. So we'll give it about 1 more minute. This is so exciting to watch live. Polls are
I love
coming
the polling features are so fun.
Yeah. All right, we have 6 or 7 folks left. So if you would like to vote, please go ahead and do so. We won't hold you to it. So let us know what you think.
That's true. And I suspect all of them might feel, relevant to you or your organization, but we're just asking for the top.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and reveal our results. Here we go. And wow.
All right. Wow, that's actually, I'm a little surprised by that, but excellent. I find often it's the securing support, how to win is the one that I expect. But this is really interesting to see that most people, 57% of you, feel like actually getting connected to the funders and funding is the biggest barrier, followed by the building rapport. And I think I would actually expect that very much given, the audience that we anticipate, which is grassroots organizations, people working for social change, people with often their own alternative models of organization. So yeah, that's definitely tricky when you're not kind of a conventional organization that the funder would expect. And then definitely, yeah, still obviously securing the support and sustaining the relationships are important. All right, so with that in mind then, I'm excited, I'll reference at least right now that part of the getting connected to funders and funding is actually, we're gonna talk around that through a lot of the workshops, but not necessarily go through resources for that. But what we are doing is sharing some resources that Stanley's gonna send out that will be available to help you start the research prospect and prospecting of grant funders. So we do want to provide support on that, but a good number of the actual workshop topics are going to be about more particulars to the sort of the third one primarily, and also sustaining the relationships, so 3 and 4. And please, if you do have specific questions between now and the other workshops related to getting connected to funders, let us know, send those to Stanley, and we can help refine and flesh out the resources that we make available for that. Okay, so moving on then with what actually lies behind these barriers then? If everyone feels these are very real barriers to securing grant funding, where do they come from? So the next slide lays out some of the parts of the grant process that are just standard, what you should expect to see when you apply for a grant. And then what I've done is add some parentheticals that just put some language to the oppressive assumptions related to those grant methodologies. So if you've done any anti-racism training or trainings on kind of oppressive power language, these should sound familiar. And I will say, as we talk about this with grants and oppression, I want to say that it's not that organizations, foundations, federal funders, public funders, it's not that they necessarily intend to limit access or create inequities with these processes. From the funder's perspective, they might actually think the opposite, that something like a firm deadline where guidelines are provided ahead of time levels the playing field, that they're actually creating an equitable system. But we'll see as we talk through some more of this that that's really not always the case. So deadlines, we anticipate that with grants, there's always a deadline, and they're usually inflexible. It's very difficult to get extensions for the most part in the grant world, unless you have a really close kind of personal relationship with a funder, or it's a family foundation, something like that. And deadlines are related to kind of the underlying assumption of urgency and quick action, so that you can't have a long collaborative process as easily when you're up against a deadline. And that often hurts work that is aimed at being equitable and accessible throughout the whole process. There's also just in general, grants are generally a competitive process. There's a limited amount of funds. You don't always know who you're up against, and it's a competitive, often covert process that sort of reinforces this idea that funding is scarce. So you have to fight for it, and also this idea of secrecy. Particular guidelines and formatting. This is a tricky one because there's nothing that feels more unfair than having your application thrown out because you forgot to make your margins 1 inch. It's happened to me before, it might happen again, but you definitely see in guidelines things like 1-inch margins, 12-point font, and there are definitely agencies and foundations that will just exclude your application completely if you don't have perfect formatting. So the underlying assumption here is perfectionism. Only the most perfect applicants will be able to succeed in that kind of system. And again, from the funder's perspective, that's often about just making sure they protect the workload of their of the people on their committees. If you have 100 applications to read in a week, if you can narrow that down to 50 because half of them didn't follow the formatting instructions, that's a really tempting thing to do to decrease a workload. You'll also see organizational requirements. So the main one for this that is different for the fund for Santa Barbara and other foundations is the requirement of something like a 501c3. And if you don't have that you're required to have a fiscal sponsor. So kind of an underlying system there would be something like paternalism, this idea that there is a certain designation that gives you the power to even be eligible for certain grants. Transactional rather than relational. I think we've kind of already gone over this quite a bit already, but this idea that you just sort of mysteriously apply, a decision gets made, and then you're told what the outcome was. It reinforces the idea of scarcity, but also sort of the secrecy of that process. The next one is you'll see a lot of requests in grant applications for data and measures of success. And that's something we're going to talk about a lot in the course of the next couple workshops as well. Because getting access to good data, collecting your own data is really important, but it's also difficult. It's not always easy if you don't have a large organization with people who are comfortable with data and collecting data. And what you'll see in a lot of applications and reporting requirements is that they want hard numbers. They want numbers, percentages, sort of mathematical, numerical ways of showing the impact of your work. And with organizations that are working for social change, that are working within communities and collaborative methods, often what you collect is really qualitative data. It's stories from people. It is, anecdotes about how lives have been changed, but there might not be that numerical data with it. So what that does is value objectivity. And the idea that data is neutral is something that most of us recognize is just impossible. There is, objectivity is really, really, it's almost a construct that doesn't exist. So, yeah, we will talk a lot about data and how to work around that. And then in terms of data as well, the next two, the next one, encouraging a deficit mindset. So you'll hear a number of times as well, we're going to talk about how to construct a statement of need for a proposal. So how to convey that there is a problem out there that your organization is fixing. And it's a standard section of a grant application. And what that can often do is encourage a deficit mindset. So emphasizing what are the needs of this particular group of people or this particular problem, and to really focus on all the negative issues and this deficit mindset that there's all these things that need to be fixed. And that often ends up perpetuating a saviorist kind of idea that, this group of people, clearly look at them, they don't know how to help themselves. So we're going to come in with this project or this program to help solve this problem. The alternative to that we'll talk about in a little bit is more of an asset-based language, right? Using language that actually says that there are assets within communities rather than focusing on negative statistics and the deficits, that we can actually flip that within an application. And then there's always going to be unwritten rules. You'll hear from people who have applied to an organization and either won or not won a grant, and they'll tell you that, you know, oh yeah, it's actually, they don't tell you this, but you need to know so-and-so or have a connection to a trustee. So there's always going to be some unwritten rules that you come up against. And the underlying assumptions there are things like secrecy, and making sure that, you know, a group of people that have the power kind of maintain that power, because you don't know who's making those decisions. And I put up this Lila Watson quote. So if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And this is an Indigenous activist from Australia who's speaking this in response to this sort of these assumptions within philanthropy and people who want to help by really imposing systems. And so this is sort of the aspirational side is how do we flip that? How do we flip that, that dialogue? And that's what then my last section is really about that. How do we flip the script? And this workshop series is about positioning you so that you can do that. And I started this one with the Ijema Oluo quote, we have to fight for our future, we have to work for change, but we also need to help people now. And that really resonates in the grant world, because there are all these issues and assumptions that we want to see change in philanthropy. And I do wholeheartedly believe that when we apply for grants, the way that we tell our stories, the way we request money can influence funders by sort of paying attention to these assumptions and the language we use to address them. And while working toward that change, we also still need to win some grants to keep doing the work that we do now. So that is what the rest of this workshop series is really going to look at, is how do you position yourself within a system that maybe has some of these oppressive assumptions at play, and get your work funded and show that social change organizations, grassroots movements, social organizing deserve a place at this table of grant funding and actually deserve to get those. So the things that we'll be doing throughout the workshops, the main thing is learning how to anticipate and prepare well. So this is related to everything from research, finding out if there was a grant application that was due in June of last year, maybe we can guess that it'll be due around the same time this year. And, you know, use last year's RFP, the request for proposals, and you can start preparing an application even before the call has come out. Your toolkit, building a toolkit, which is creating these building blocks so that you have all these different pieces, and whenever an application comes out, you can shuffle them around and draw from information you've already compiled. And that's really what the meat of these workshops is going to be, is helping you build that toolkit. The next is building relationships. So wherever possible, you can try to find the individuals at these foundations and at these agencies, because if you have a personal relationship, you can ask questions, you can encourage transparency. So just like the previous slide, in the parentheticals on this one, I put, what are those alternate values? So instead of secrecy, as grant seekers, we can request transparency and even demand it if that's appropriate from certain funders. And the best way to do that is to build relationships. The next one is accessing data. We're going to share some resources on how to access data. We're going to talk through how to collect your own through a number of different methods. And what this does is also it asserts the value of subjectivity. So if you can speak about the value and the success measures of your work in a way that doesn't require absolute numerical justification, then that also starts to shift the needle a little bit. The next one, emphasizing collaboration. So this one is one that grassroots organizations and social organizers are already way ahead of other organizations when it comes to things like collaboration. You already see the value in working together around large problems, and that encourages the value of abundance rather than scarcity, that resources can be shared and are actually amplified and multiplied in collaborative spaces. And this is one also that dovetails nicely with some funders really prioritize collaboration because they actually think collaboration is a better investment. There's less places for a collaboration to fail if there's, you know, a number of people involved. So that's a good one to continue to emphasize in grant seeking. And then be intentional with your language. So I talked about that a bit on the last slide, trying to use asset-based language rather than deficit-based language, and decolonizing your language, right? Things like saviorism in the world of grants really gets reinforced through language. And I think all of these sort of systems come down to just telling your story in your own way. And that in and of itself will influence funders. The more grassroots organizations go out and seek funding that maybe they haven't normally gone after, like federal grants, large pots of public money, but also all of our local foundations. There are foundations in Santa Barbara County who have been influenced by the way the fund runs its grant making process. And so when you go to other organizations to apply for grant funding, you can use these tools to actually influence the way that those funders see the work that they do. So we hope that with the rest of these workshops, we can help you all build those toolkits, those little building blocks to really make this feel a lot more possible, and also, you know, sort of demystify this whole process. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And so I am going to talk with you about how to construct a proposal. How to construct a proposal that does indeed follow those rules and positions you for success in your grant seeking. Basically, your proposal is you're telling a story in a narrative format. And that story is really a series of building blocks, as it were, that are sequential in nature. Can you go to the next slide, Stanley? Sequential in nature, and you're telling a story about who you are, what you do, why you do it, and most importantly, why your organization is best positioned to do this. Usually your narrative begins with a brief history of your organization, the population that you serve, and what your mission is. And you're telling the funder really why they should be investing in you. So a proposal usually follows in a format that's sequential, that looks at a number of components. Yes, your application may have specific questions that you answer and so on. But generally speaking, if you can address these, let's say 9 different topic areas, which we will discuss in a great deal of detail over the next 2 sessions, you will definitely have a successful proposal. What is the need or the problem that you're addressing? You will identify your overarching goal, that is what it is you hope to change in the community, in the population you serve, and the objectives and activities. The objectives are those outcomes that you hope to achieve. And the activities, of course, how you're going to go about attaining the objectives. You will definitely be asked to put together a project description, talks a little bit about who you are and what you do. And your methods of implementing the project. It's your theory of change, as it were, and how you're going to unfold this project over time. You'll be asked to put together a timeline and a work plan. And I want to emphasize that this timeline is really focused on the project period of the funding cycle of the grant. Yes, you will have done this work before the grant cycle, and you will continue afterwards. However, the funder is most likely wants to know how you're going to use the money, what are the activities you're going to do within this project period. And then, of course, your methods of evaluation. What are the outcomes that you hope to achieve? All of that gets translated into your budget, or as I like to call it, a resource plan. And this is really a translation of the activities into dollars. So when you're putting together your timeline, your work plan, think about what is it going to cost? What am I going to need to implement that activity? Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about each of these components. So the needs statement, as Rachel was saying earlier, it profiles the problem and describes the population experiencing the situation. And it is essential here to use data to support the premise that in fact there is a need. You'll identify your overarching goal, what it is you wish to change. I would say typically you might have one goal, but then you might have a few different objectives. The objectives are the outcomes, how you will attain the goal. Your activities are going to be what you do to meet the objectives, and these we call outputs. So this begins the foundational building blocks of your proposal. Additional components will include, on the next slide, your project description. This is the detail of your concept, the detail of the delivery system, and the services that you will provide. Again, your timeline and work plan. They might ask you about staffing. They might not use that term, but it would be important to tell the funder who's going to manage this grant, who's going to implement these activities, what are their qualifications to do so. This goes to the credibility of your organization, that in fact you are qualified to undertake this effort. Your methods of evaluation are important here too, because you need to have methods in place throughout the project period to gather the data you're going to need to determine whether or not you're meeting your objectives. So how are you going to gather that data? Will it be surveys? Will it be pre-test, post-test? Will it be observational data? We'll talk about that in more detail, but definitely not something you leave to the end of the project. And good to write about it in your narrative so that the funder knows you have the credibility to be able to do this. And finally, you'll be asked to produce a budget. And the budget includes not only the dollars that you're requesting, but the resources that you already have. All grant projects actually cost your organization something, whether it's staffing, whether it's a facility. There's some effort that you put into making this grant project work. And it's good to let them know that you have this resource and can rely on this expertise within your organization. Rachel mentioned a little bit about mission alignment, and this is crucially important. This is important because, believe it or not, the funder, no matter who they are, they have a reason for being. Regardless of their motives, they believe they want to impact the common good, and they're doing it according to the methods that they have at their hand. But they have a mission statement, they have a strategic plan, they're giving this money to the community for specific reasons, and it is important that your mission align with their mission, because they're investing in you, but you want to be able to tell them that they can rely on you to help further their mission. You both want to impact the common good. You both want to be able to further the efforts that you have in your mission statements. So that alignment is important. And finally, I'm going to say just a word about the proposal review, which was addressed a little bit earlier. Yes, your proposal will be reviewed, and no, you may not know who, in fact, is reviewing your proposal. It may be one person, it may be a team of people. They may have a checklist that they go through to see, did you check this box? Did you check this box? They may give you a rating scale. They have particular criteria that they evaluate the proposal based on. But the point that I want to make is that it's important to write your narrative, to tell your story, as if the reviewer is not familiar with the details of the sector you work in. They may not be. You're telling a compelling story, not only that's designed to inform the reader about the work that you do, but you're attempting to really engage them to become advocate on behalf of funding your proposal. So that is important. Now, you heard from Rachel on the systemic rules governing the grant-making process, and I very quickly gave you an overview of some of those components that go into a fundable proposal. But your story is incomplete without this other foundational principle that Jennifer is going to discuss with you, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Rachel, for all of that info. So yeah, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it applies to grant writing specifically. And, you know, as you saw, there's a lot of inherent kind of systems of oppression within grant writing. And so adding this into your, or within the grant system overall, so adding this into your grant writing is really important. I want to make a couple acknowledgements. So first and foremost, I do want to acknowledge that I am a person of color. I identify as a Mexicana, and I do want to say this was a very collaborative space where, you know, I was really able to bring this to the table and say, hey, I want to share this with the group, but we can't always rely on our people of color to be the ones who bring this into the space and to share this work. So that is just an acknowledgement that I want to make. I also want to say that sometimes, you know, especially when we're talking about systems of oppression or topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes folks can be a little bit uncomfortable. If you do at any point feel uncomfortable during this part of the presentation, I do encourage you to take a moment to do whatever you can to care for yourself, but I also encourage you to lean into the discomfort and take a moment to learn more about these subjects on your own. All right, so before I get into it, I want to start with a poll. So I just want to see who here has heard about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just want to do a quick read of the room. So Stanley, if you could please bring up the poll. And the poll is in English and Spanish side by side. So you'll first see it in Spanish, but then if you keep reading, the second half of it is in English for those folks who need it in English or in Spanish. So we'll give you a few seconds to answer the poll.
All right, thank you everybody for voting. I have the privilege of getting a sneak peek, so this is pretty exciting. It's been just a little bit longer. Wonderful. Okay, well, the moment we've all been waiting for. Here we go.
All right, so this is really good. Looks like almost everyone has at least heard about it, and some folks, you know, have heard somewhat about it. So the level of skill that you have, or the level, how much you've heard about it, isn't what the focus of today is, but I am going to go ahead and do some definition setting just for the purposes of our workshop, okay? So first, I'm going to start with diversity. So what exactly is diversity, equity, and inclusion? That's what we're getting to next. So we'll start with diversity. So the word diverse in and of itself just means having variety, right? So you can have diverse ice cream flavors. You can have diverse pieces of clothing, you can have whatever. It's just a variety, right? And it can be applied to lots of different contexts. In the workplace, and as we know it, and as we've been introduced to this concept, it's typically been related to race and ethnicity. And you can, you know, if you all remember all of those like diversity in the workplace videos from like, must have been from like the 80s to the early 2000s, right? It's typically been about diversity among racial, different races and ethnicities. Now this definition has been expanded, and it also includes everything that we see here on the screen. So it's also included but not limited to race, color, ethnicity. Stanley, do you mind closing your file explorer? Thank you. Nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, veteran status, education, marital status, language, age, gender, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, mental or physical ability, genetic information, and learning styles. So the reason why diversity matters is it's important in representation. So like as Rachel mentioned earlier, funders want to see, and this is really important to us at the Fund for Santa Barbara, and it's a question on our grant proposal, but we want to see that the people who you are serving have some sort of say or are included in your decision-making process in some way or another. Just having them at the table is not enough, and that's where equity and inclusion come in, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I do want to say that, you know, having them at the table is kind of the first step in the whole DEI framework. I also want to acknowledge this quote by, if you could go back, Stanley, by Angela Davis, which is, I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is a corporate strategy. And that is absolutely true. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a framework that you can apply to your work, but it is not at all a synonym for justice. It's kind of a step on in the staircase to justice, if you will. And I do have tendencies to go so far off the radar as to say that, you know, the revolution is not going to be, is not going to have 501c3 status, but that's a whole other thing. And so we work within the systems that we can, right? Okay, so moving on to equity. So equity ensures the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all, while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So equity is rooted in fairness, right? It's not so much everyone has an equal opportunity. It actually gets away from this thought that if you provide every single person with equal whatever, equal opportunity, equal access, then they should have the same outcome. That's not true. So let's say, you know, you have this program, right? You're developing this program that you're going to request funding for, and this program is going to serve a particular group of people, and you've brought on those people onto your program planning, or to your team or your board or whatever it is, right? So that they can share their voices. However, there may be a barrier. There could be a language barrier. Maybe you're serving Spanish speaking people, and so you've asked Spanish speaking people to come to your table, right? But if there's no interpretation provided, if there's no way for them to actually communicate with you, then they don't have the same opportunity, right? So if we look at this graphic that I have here, I really love this graphic because it does a really great job of conceptualizing equity versus equality. And then it also goes so far as to say like, hey, this is the reality that we live in, and we should strive for liberation. So if you look at this, if we look at the equality slide, right? We have these three people. In this particular case, the way that the artist chose to represent it is they have these different heights, and there's this fence that doesn't allow them to see the baseball field. So the baseball field would be access to food, access to transportation, whatever it is, right? Access to healthcare. The fence would be all of the barriers to that, right? There's not enough public transportation, healthcare is way too expensive, whatever it is, right? And then you give these people all one block, so you give them all a resource. So everyone gets a voucher for public transportation or something. So then the person on the left, right, they already maybe had access to public transportation or whatever to get to their medical appointments. Maybe they already have insurance. And so you just gave them a little bit of a bump, and now they have an even better view, right? The person in the middle has a resource, and now, you know, they can see over the fence, whereas before maybe they couldn't have. So you gave them the voucher for public transportation, and now they can get to their medical appointment, right? The person on the right, however, can't even get over the fence. They maybe have different barriers. So you've given them the same voucher to public transportation, right? So that they can get to their doctor's appointment or to whatever it is. But as we can see, they still can't seem to achieve that. And why that is, there could be many other different reasons. They might need different resources. And so with equity, we take that into account. So the person on the left now no longer has the block. So that person didn't need public transportation in the first place to get to their doctor's appointment because maybe they had a car already. So we don't need to give them any resources. They're good. The person in the middle still needs the resources to be able to get to whatever they need to get to. And then the person on the right needs a little bit more support to put them at the same level as the other two folks. And so that's equity. The reality that we live in, and I'm going over this graphic in a little bit, not like quite in consequential order, but the reality is that lots of people hold privileges over others. And then also, a lot of the times they hoard resources, including, you know, financial, everything. So that's the reality that we live in. And then you have this like middle group that kind of, you know, can see over the fence, and, you know, they're in this like okay ground. And then you have these folks that have no access to resources. And as a matter of fact, they're even pushed down in a hole, as you can see for the person on the right. Liberation is something that I'm not going to get into, but liberation is actually the elimination of those barriers in the first place. So there's no fence and everyone can see the baseball field. And I do encourage you all to do a little bit of research on liberation on your own. I will say that equity is important, like I said, to not just bring people to the table, but make sure that they can participate and they can be included, which will moves us forward to our next slide, Stanley. So when it comes to inclusion, inclusion is authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into processes, activities, and decision and policy making in a way that shares power and ensures equal access to opportunities and resources. When we look at this definition and we see equal, we want to make sure we're thinking equitable. And just so you know, all of these definitions are also from UC Berkeley, so you may have seen different explanations of any of these, and that's all totally fine. That's why we're defining them for the purposes of this presentation. So actually, what is her name? Verna Myers coined the phrase, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. So for example, let's say a really easy example of this is like back to school nights, right? So I don't know if this is still the case, but when I was growing up and we had back to school nights, all back to school nights invited everyone, right? They invited the parents of all of the students at the school, but they were monolingual in English, right? So for monolingual Spanish speaking parents, there was no interpretation. So my parents, even though they came and they were listening, they couldn't actively participate because if they had a question in Spanish, there was no interpretation provided, and they maybe understood half the stuff that was even being shared to them. So even though those voices are, you know, sitting there at the table, they're not actually able to be included. And so I really like this graphic because it shows us how diversity, you know, is just bringing different folks to the table, but inclusion is actually helping them participate actively. So now that we've done some basic definition setting, so why does this matter? Well, this goes back to those systems that Rachel mentioned. And again, when we talk a lot about this work, we talk a lot about intent versus impact. And although the intent of the funders is not, you know, to leave out grassroots organizations, the way that the system is set up inherently leaves out a lot of the times grassroots organizations that are the ones that actually have the most inclusion of the people that they're serving. So that's really important. Also, what you say and how you say it matters, right? Language really matters. And so having a diversity, equity, and inclusion framework in your grant writing is really important for ensuring the dignity of the individuals that you serve. The last thing we want to do when writing a grant proposal is further marginalize the individuals who we are, you know, seeking funding for. And a lot of the times, as Rachel mentioned, there is some saviorism, right, in grant writing. There is some like, oh, well, we know what's best for this community, or we know what they need in order to come out of these circumstances. And we need to understand that we're not here to save anyone, and we need to be listening to those groups that we are developing programs for, to make sure that we treat them with dignity and we don't further marginalize them. And not in this workshop, but in the next workshop, I will be talking more about language and how to change your language so that you can, you know, treat the people that you serve with dignity, but also just having diversity, equity, and inclusion in your program planning and bringing those people to the table, giving them the tools that they need to participate, and then having them fully participate, you know, creating that safe space for them to bring their full selves, to give you feedback on what's working well and what maybe needs to be changed or what maybe needs to be different, is really important in building a really strong program. And the whole concept, the whole framework of diversity, equity, and inclusion is fairly recent. So, you know, it's still a work in progress, but as it's you know, gaining more traction or becoming more popular among organizations, you will see that funders are placing a greater emphasis on it, and they really want to see that organizations, you know, are representative of the people that they serve, and that leadership and management is representative of the people that they serve. And so that's something for you to think in mind as well as you're doing your program planning and developing programs, is making sure that you are including, if you're serving, you know, if you're serving LGBTQ plus individuals, that you're including LGBTQ plus individuals in your program planning. If you're serving BIPOC folks, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, if you've never heard that word or that acronym, that you're including BIPOC people in your program planning and in your program facilitation as well. So those are some of the reasons that DEI matters in grant writing. Again, we'll give more examples of like what that language shift actually looks like in our next couple presentations. We'll talk about what it looks like in crafting the needs statement and kind of getting away from the deficit mindset that Rachel mentioned and going more towards assets. And then also in evaluation and dignifying our folks in evaluation. So yeah, thank you so much. And it looks like we're going to move on to Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the three of you. I'm so grateful that we just got to witness all of this. So now we're going to pivot to our question and answer portion. We're well ahead of schedule. We have plenty of time. And so I just want to open it up with any questions from our attendees. Please feel free to use the chat feature, the Q&A feature, whichever is more convenient at this point. And we'll go ahead and refer to our panelists to answer it. And I'll go ahead and kick this off to a question from Jeremiah, who asked, when writing about budgets, should we mention potential or planned impact in kind, or would it be better to leave this out? So which one of you has any thoughts about that?
I'm happy to jump in on a budget question. Yeah, thank you for that. And we're definitely going to spend a good amount of time. I believe it is in workshop 2 on budgets, and really, how to put them together from scratch, and also look at specific things like that. But I think one of the things we will be talking about is how important it is to put together a full cost budget, and in kind is definitely an important part of our work. I think a lot of times in grants, we underestimate what it takes to run the programs that we do, and volunteer hours, in-kind support, even if it's like stamps or supplies, things like that, is absolutely part of your budget. And it's important for funders, I think, to see that all of those things come together to support your work.
Great, thanks so much. All right, moving on, we have another question coming in. So as a grantor, and a question about even, is that the correct word? So it's, as a funder or an organization that awards grants, what are some communication techniques for getting the word out to as broad of an audience as possible? So what, and this is a good question that I know that the fund struggles with and works on as well. So yeah, what are some communication avenues or techniques in getting the word out and really reaching the intended audience?
I don't know that, we have any guidance around that because we are not grantors. We are, here for grant seeking. I will say that in the next, I think it's in the next workshop, we do talk about avenues where you can seek grant funding. And so it might be good for the person asking about where grantors can publicize their grants and stuff, to think about those resources that we will give in the next workshop.
Great, thank you. And I know from personal experience, when it comes to the fund's own work, outreach is just as important as our actual programmatic work, just because if you're not reaching your intended applicant pool, and you don't have a series of applicants who fit your mission, who align with everything that your organization strives to do, then it's a lot of spinning your wheels, so to speak, right? It's and that outreach, both kind of broadly and intentionally sought out, is really key to being effective as a grantor, a funder. So, and it's an ongoing process, I would say. And I think one of the nuances of this that I want to elevate is that a lot of times community foundations such as the fund, for example, already have a pulse on the community and are already well known by folks who might be doing this work. And so it's much easier for a small local foundation to be in touch with who their potential applicants might be versus, say, for example, a large statewide or national funder. And oftentimes, government funding can be really removed from that as well if it's not really at the local level, and relies on intermediaries such as local community foundations to help reach the intended population.
Can I say something to that?
Please.
So I would say that if you're a funder and you want to be more inclusive of various populations, I would say, following on what Jennifer talked about, that you have an obligation to inform yourself about those communities by including them in your program planning. Now, when funders develop an initiative that they want to fund, they do gather information. They do look at data. They do sometimes bring in people to inform them about the issues. So that's certainly the case with federal and state funding. You know, they have panels and they gather data and then they create an initiative. So it's up to you to make sure that you get that information and include the people in your program planning as you design the initiative that you want to provide funding for.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a question: how do you get around not having a 501c3 status?
Well, I think you ally with somebody who does have that status and use them as a fiscal agent for your work. And they may charge you a certain fee to do that because they would be administering the grant program, the financial aspects of the grant reporting and overseeing, making sure that you tidy up with all the nuts and bolts that the funder requires. But that is very doable, is to use a fiscal agent to ally yourself with.
And that's something that we come across quite a bit at the Fund for Santa Barbara. It's not common that funders will fund organizations that do not have a 501c3 status. And we pride ourselves in really offering that to groups who don't, right? We will accept, for example, a charitable needs statement, an organizational bank account, and fund those groups that aren't necessarily already registered. And oftentimes we'll provide that alongside support on how you might seek that designation out. But it's important, especially in my experience, to have that option available for groups that are just starting out, right? The groups that are kind of, just kind of in their nascent stages of their organizational development. So let's go ahead and move on to a question from Sophia. Thank you everyone again for weighing in, and feel free to keep your questions coming in. So Sophia asks, when you apply for a general operating grant and it asks for a project budget and an overall budget, are these one and the same for general operating grants? I would say no, but maybe we could expand that question a little bit to kind of what picture you're painting, so to speak, with each of those different answers, right? The project budget and the overall budget. What strikes each of you with that?
I can start. We will talk more in depth about project budgets versus general operating budgets, and Rachel will really get into that in workshop 2. They are not the same. They are asking for different things, right? Like your whole budget, your organizational budget for like a general operating request might be, you might have an organization with a revenue of $400,000, whereas your project budget is specifically for one project that you're delivering out of your organization. And that's going to be more like maybe that program costs $50,000. You can also get, depending on the size of your organization, much higher than that, right? These are relatively low numbers, but they are not one and the same. They are different. You can kind of ask not so much for a general like the terms general operating and program are different and they're not interchangeable. So if you're asking for a program, you can ask for different expenses within that program, or you can even say, we're going to use this for this program as needed. And then you might in your mind think this is kind of like a general operating for this program, but it's not the same as like a general operating grant for your organization. Rachel, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that was excellent. I mean, I feel like we really are going to spend a significant amount of time in the next workshop looking at budgets and sort of how to get the most out of every single budget is really the goal too, right? I mean, every program does overlap with your operating budget. Every program still has overhead costs. I'm jumping ahead. I see there is a question about overhead costs. I don't know if you want me to, I'll flow right into that one, which is.
I totally anticipated.
Yes, I'll
segue.
I'll read it too. So Molly's question is, do you have thoughts on how or whether to include overhead costs in grant budgets, or any advice, resources for securing funds to keep the lights on? And this is a great question. It's an ongoing debate in philanthropy in general of like why funders would even say things like, we're going to fund your program, but we're not going to allow you to use any money to keep your lights on, or right, because it's completely counterintuitive to supporting programs when you don't support the infrastructure and the staffing that makes those programs possible. So I think the advice on that, well, the answer to the first part is absolutely always include overhead. And we will talk a little bit about how to do that by incorporating what we might separate out as overhead and actually reintegrating those types of expenses into program budgets. So it doesn't look like overhead anymore. It's actually an integral part of a program budget. And then the advice is just, other than those strategies, really just continuing to have those conversations with funders. I applied for a grant recently, and the funder, I noticed from the time I had applied previously to now, their indirect cost cap, which indirect cost, just another way of saying overhead, was all of a sudden 15%. And it used to be, it used to be not directly named, and then it was 10% for a while, and I noticed that it went up to 15. So sometimes 15 is still not high enough, but there is a trend that funders are starting to talk about that more. So I think, asking questions and building those relationships with funders to talk about overhead is still something that, if you're in the philanthropy machine, we need to keep that conversation going.
And I would add,
oh, go ahead, Jen.
Sorry, I would add to that, if you ever have the opportunity to conduct a stakeholder survey, to fill out a stakeholder survey that was sent to you by a funder, by a foundation, whether or not you've applied to them, if it's like a funder in your area. So like periodically, like the Santa Barbara Foundation will send out stakeholder surveys, right? If you get your hands on one of those and you have the opportunity, like that's a place where you can give feedback to the funder and be like, hey, you can't tell me that I can run this program, but you're not like, I need a classroom to run it. Like I need electricity to run my PowerPoint to give this presentation. So you can't just expect me, to run a program without these costs. And those are great ways to give feedback to funders. So if you ever see any of those surveys coming your way, please fill them out and give feedback to those folks so that they also know.
Those are all really, really great points. And I, just speaking of the grant funding machine that you brought up, Rachel, it is something that thankfully is changing, as you pointed out, in terms of what funders are looking for. And it also, I think, speaks to the limitations on certain more removed rating sites for nonprofits, right? These are like the Guide Stars or, those kind of platforms where they're really well intended around giving donors visibility into the organization's operations, but until not that long ago, they would kind of really be really not support funding general overhead and operations, which was pretty problematic for a lot of organizations. But now, as you point out, there's been this shift. I know California Nonprofits, Association of Nonprofits has had this effort as a campaign to the overhead project, as they call it, which is to elevate that issue as well.
Yeah, Stanley, I just want to jump in. That's a great point, because I think it's really important, you know, if people are interested, the history of this conversation within the world of philanthropy, because GuideStar is one of the organizations that rates nonprofits, and you can get sort of different levels of certification or sort of acknowledgement. And one of the good things about GuideStar is actually the criteria it takes into account is often about transparency. So how available are your financials and different metrics? So rating transparency is very helpful to the sector. But if you go back and, you know, you can research articles on, you know, this was 5-7 years ago, really, where a lot of criticism came up about Charity Navigator, which was another nonprofit that rated nonprofit organizations. And one of their main metrics for giving a high or low rating was your overhead ratio. So they would celebrate organizations that kept overhead as low as possible. And that was definitely a factor in then influencing the way funders would make decisions. So they would say, oh, this place has a great Charity Navigator rating. We should give them money because they don't waste money on overhead. And yet what that rating did was often give higher marks to organizations that underpaid staff, right? Like used other ways to keep that number low. And I think underpaying staff and like the removal of benefits is one of the, biggest criticisms of the nonprofit sector in general, is that people are going to work for less than what they are worth because of this idea that we need to keep overhead low. So, that conversation is shifting, but I mean, it is. If people are interested, just kind of Googling the overhead project, that's a great one to see the history of that conversation, because it's still a fight, and it's one that you can influence just by the way that you write about your own organization.
It's almost like you anticipated the next question in the queue, Rachel, in terms of pay for nonprofit staff. So obviously that's an issue where we want to make sure that our actions align with our values. We don't want the nonprofit sector to be the sector of poverty, and so often there are many reasons that are put forth as to why nonprofits don't pay their staff better and compensate them well and adequately. That notion of doing more with less is so prevalent, and I feel like this is just now more of a conversation that's bubbling up in the sphere, in the sector, and that is my long segue to Dylan's question, who asks, as a small-scale organization that is rapidly evolving, has never had full-time paid staff, and is largely run on volunteer work, I've been told that including full-time salary compensation in our operating budget, that's within a higher range, is a better fund-seeking strategy than shooting for more quote-unquote realistic numbers with much lower salary scales. So Dylan is bringing up the point that they were told that funders see small salaries as suspect. Is this true? Our number one priority is getting staff compensated, and we are struggling to access this kind of funding. And so what strikes me in that is that I know as the three of you can each speak to this well with your own experience in the grant making committee, right? The discussion around pay is really key, and for me was counterintuitive, to be quite honest, because I had to unlearn my own assumptions about funders, wanting to cut costs at every corner, when in reality there are other considerations at play which would support what Dylan is hearing as well. So could you all speak to that from your insight into it all?
Yeah, I can start. One of the things on the grant making committee, and I can only speak for my experience on the fund, and I don't know if this holds true for all funders, but one of the things from the grant making committee, we look at budgets pretty closely. There's some of us that are more inclined to look at budgets, some of us that are less inclined to look at budgets, because the I mean, the Fund for Santa Barbara's Grant Making Committee is a very diverse space, and with lots of different people. You know, some of us have grant writing experience, some of us don't. But one of the things that I know I'm committed to is making sure that folks are being paid well and being fairly compensated, because one of the huge things that isn't talked about, and it's starting to get talked about now, is the fact that nonprofits largely underpay their staff and expect folks to have you know, be guided by the mission. And there is a certain extent, you know, to which you are guided by the mission when you work for a nonprofit, but there's also survival, and there's also the fact that people need to make a living. And especially in a place, you know, like Santa Barbara, where, you know, we're really an expensive place to live, we want to make sure that folks can live off of their salaries. And so we're really committed. And whenever I look at a salary, I'm like, okay, great. If a salary is too low, I don't necessarily think it's suspect, but I do, you know, we have the opportunity to then talk to the organization through a site visit and say, hey, like, what's going on? Why is the salary so low? And learn a little bit more about maybe some of their reasoning, and also maybe give some guidance of like, hey, we need to pay folks well. I do encourage you to put that full salary on there, and ask for it. You know, you got to ask for what you need. And you also got to make sure you're fairly compensating your employees. So I encourage you to ask for that. And that's my piece on it.
That's great. And I just want to elevate, and I'll avoid getting on my soapbox because I have a tendency of doing this with this topic in particular. But the fund does have a benefits and compensation survey that we have publicly available to anybody who's interested. And that resource really attempts to take into account the type of nonprofit, the type of role, even the organizational budget within that. And I want to mention that because it's, I think, you know, in terms of kind of workers' rights and how we treat our workers, the more that we talk about pay and compensation and equity, the better off everyone tends to be. You know, I think the realities of the sector, unfortunately, oftentimes replicate some of the problematic kind of, you know, employer-employee relationships that are so toxic to outside of the sector. And so, yeah, so again, pay and equity, very important to talk about, and it's obviously very related to your funding proposals. I did get on that. I'm sorry about that.
I want to add something to that conversation, that I always advocate that people put together a very accurate and realistic budget, because you need to know what you need. You need to know what things are really going to cost you. Now, you won't always get your entire funding from one source. And if you're putting together a project proposal and you have salaries that are going to pertain, well, it'll probably be just a percentage of somebody's time dedicated to that project, in which case you would allocate just a percentage of their salary to that project. You are most likely going to need multiple funding sources for all of your work. And so it's good to have that all reflected. You know, sometimes you can have multiple columns on your budget that show where you're getting some other funding from to piece it all together. And what you're bringing to the table, as you know, we were discussing earlier, your matching funds, your indirect costs, that's all important to put into the budget as well.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks for the shout out from one of our participants who said that we do a great job of setting up virtual backgrounds with our succulents and plants. So I thought that was really funny because this is our new reality, right? It's this is how we set up our space. So I thought that was really funny and sweet. Thank you. So pivoting now to two more questions that came in. We have one from Lene, who asks, how do we change the oppressive nature of philanthropy when many grantors still have to center a dominant class of donors that hold many deficit or savior mindsets, set of mindsets? And that came in actually from Chelsea and Lene. So just a simple question, right?
Right. Oh, I'm super happy to jump in on that. So simple. Yes, and it's a simple answer. No, of course not. But yeah, I mean, that's the tricky part is, you know, we've talked about ways that we can influence some of those assumptions made by organizations through the way we write about our programs and the way we apply for funding. But, you know, the flip side of that is that the foundations we apply to for funding are raising their money from other people, right? I mean, not all of them are just, you know, huge endowments that, you know, existed in the past and are now just being used in a vacuum. Most foundations are actively fundraising and then passing on those funds through grants. And that's a tricky question, because even if the foundation itself and its leadership or its board are you know, moving in a certain direction, sometimes their funders are not. I think in recent, you know, the recent months with a lot of the conversations around racial equity and solidarity statements about Black Lives Matter have resulted in loss of funders. There are a number of organizations in our community who have lost funders because they put out those statements. And that's how you know that the leadership of an organization feels one way, but their funders may not. And I think it's such a hard question to answer, because you can do the work with the people you have relationships with, right? I mean, I think relational trust is the foundation of so much social change in philanthropy as well, like getting at those questions. Because you can't teach people who aren't in conversation with you or who aren't in a place to be ready to listen. And so I think, you know, in the grant seeking world, you start with the relationships you actually have. And yeah, I mean, I'd like to think being intentional about our language is enough to sort of have a trickle down effect on some of these people. But ultimately, you know, funders might just get lost. The saviorism, like I think white saviorism and wealthy saviorism, those two particular categories, I mean, it's so entrenched in a lot of donors' self-worth, right? They give money so they can feel that way. And that's a hard thing to dismantle. So I think what I'd love to hear throughout this workshop, or just, you know, in other conversations, is what are some of your ideas about that as people working in your particular area? You know, it'd be interesting to sort of compile stories and conversations that you all have had with funders that kind of get at some strategies around that, because it's a really important question.
And I can add, in my experience in grant writing, a lot of the times in grants is where you have the opportunity to do a little bit more education of, you know, your reader. And we'll talk more about like knowing your audience and that stuff in the upcoming workshops. But you have the ability to educate your reader a little bit more than if you're doing like a direct mail piece. If we're thinking about like individual versus grant, you have the ability to educate folks. So when the term, like, I'll give you an example. When the term Latinx came up, right, to be gender neutral and be inclusive of LGBTQ plus identities, to get rid of Latina/O, I would write that into my proposals. When I was referring to Latinx populations, I would put in parens gender neutral identifier for Latina/O. And I did have a couple site visits, because, you know, some of the funders that I wrote to did site visits, and I had one specific site visit where there was a woman, and she was like, oh, she's like, I didn't even know Latinx was a thing. She was like, I identify as Latina. I was like, she was like, I mean, is that wrong? And I was like, no, you can still yourself identify as a Latina. That's your identifier and that's who you are. But just for the purposes of inclusivity of all of these other folks, you know, we use Latinx to refer to this broader group of people to make sure we're being gender inclusive as well. And so those are little ways in which you can also educate the funder and kind of move towards that. And unfortunately, yeah, sometimes you're going to put out a statement and the funder is going to be like, I don't align with this, and you might lose that funding. And as difficult as that is, we have to stick, you know, to our values. We can't jeopardize our values for the sake of a donor or the sake of funding, right? And that's difficult but necessary. You know, and dollars sometimes are scarce, and we just have to find ways to kind of grapple with it as we go. There's no clear answer, I don't think.
Great, thank you for all of that. And we have just one more question from Dylan. Although most proposals that I've submitted have been in Q&A format, there are also applications that require a complete narrative paragraph style format. The outline, which you walked us through, Suzanne, what is the suggested placement for including information on staff? So maybe we could open this up a bit broader to what are ways in which you can inform your funder beyond kind of the narrow questions that you're asked in an application. I think that might be a helpful approach.
Well, you know, you're going to include a section that is your project description. And so I think your staffing can be included in the project description. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And this is who is going to do it. These are their qualifications to do it. So sometimes you're asked to actually outline someone's qualifications, but not always. And like I said, it's not always in a separate section, but you can include it in your project description.
Great. And I know we'll get into a lot more detail on the different elements of writing a grant proposal, sneak peek. So let's go ahead and pivot over to discussing our homework, because yes, we did include homework in this workshop. And so I'd like one of you to please guide us through that portion of it.
I think that's my job today. And we were going to look at the learning outcomes. So today, hopefully, we have addressed this first learning objective in helping you to understand the explicit and implicit rules of grant seeking from 3 different perspectives. But for your homework and in preparation for the second workshop, we would like you to tackle these challenges. Begin to write about the problem or the need statement that your project addresses. And, you know, a couple of paragraphs, just try to articulate what the problem is and who's experiencing the problem. And even though we said earlier that this section will include a lot of data, maybe you have that data, maybe not yet, but there's a context in which this issue exists, and so start to write about that. And also move on to the next section, the intended population that's experiencing this situation. And oops, there goes the screen. And talk about that a little bit. What are the challenges? What are the circumstances that they're experiencing? And you know, try to think about it from the assets perspective and not the needs, the deficits perspective. You know, these people have resources, people have a lot of resilience and talents to bring to help their situation. And we'd also like you to start thinking about the expenses, what it's going to take financially for you to implement your projects, and start gathering your organization's income documents and you know, putting it together where your sources of income are. And as a bonus feature, in preparation for workshop 2, we're going to go over the Foundation Roundtables Common Grant Application. So you're challenged to see if you can find that on the internet and download that and have that at the ready for the next workshop. And thank you so much for your time today.
Great, thank you so much for walking us through that, Suzanne. And we had a couple more questions that came in, which I want to encourage more of, and we'll certainly have more Q&A time in both of our remaining sessions. In the meantime, I also want to encourage you all to continue staying in touch. Feel free to email me or call me. And with any questions or feedback that you have. We want to make this a responsive workshop for everybody, and hope you'll join us for the next 2 sessions, where we'll be diving in quite a bit more to a lot of these topics that our panelists so well introduced. The dates are here, as well as you'll receive reminders. And yeah, I just want to provide just a huge shout out to our presenters. Your insight is just so invaluable, and you're bringing just such a rich variety of perspectives and nuances. It's such an important niche in information, especially for social change movement building organizations. Thanks again to you, Naida, for your interpretation help with all of our materials and being so responsive and thoughtful and effective in your work. And last, but certainly not least, my gratitude goes out to each and every one of you who's spending your time with us today, and knowing many of the organizations that you put your time and energy into. I'm thankful for your work in our communities and region. So with that, we'll see you next week. And please keep an eye out for materials that we'll be sending you, including the homework, some fact sheets, and then a recording. And please feel free to invite others. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.